the story of this university's troubled pursuit of autonomy. But these ideals have not always been congenial to one another. The quest for world-class excellence and the pursuit of social relevance, in particular, are two gods we have not always been able to serve with equal fidelity. We are constantly being pulled toward one altar or the other. And yet what is interesting is that both, at different times, have served as the battle cry for the Autopoiesis of Academe. Continual search for a distinct institutional identity, the stubborn assertion of autonomy from anything that threatens to colonize the knowledge enterprise, the insistence on the necessity of critique, the instinctive revulsion against every type of dogma, and the readiness to offer refuge to all forms of dissident voices. Yet, even as they compete with one another, these are not necessarily contradictory values. The problem of striking a balance between being socially relevant on one hand, and being faithful to the idea of a university on the other has been UP's most difficult and unceasing dilemma. This problem underpins nearly all the thorny decisions that UP has had to make with respect to admissions, enrollments, academic programs, research, budget, tuition policy, partnership with business, student and faculty activism, and the language of instruction. UP, of course, has always imagined itself as more than just a center of higher learning. In our sublime moments, we like to think of our university not only as the brain of the Filipino nation, but its conscience as well. To the extent that every university worth its name feels justified in calling itself the home of the sciences, and the wellspring of modern reason, such a university may indeed be called the brain of society. But where might the role of conscience of the nation come from? One can only guess that it comes from UP's unique standing as the Filipino nation's first state university, a fact that is both a source of pride as well as a burden. The idea of a university as the starting point of a people's journey to modern nationhood was very much in the minds of our leaders when the short-lived Malolos Republic proposed the creation of the Universidad Literaria de Filipinas. This, as we know, did not become a reality until June 18, 1908, which is the founding day of our university, when Act number 1870, the law creating the UP, was passed, at which point the short-lived independent republic had already succumbed to American rule. As may be gleaned from the expectations that attended its establishment, UP was to be the key to Philippinization and economic progress under American rule. Its first president, the American theologian Murray Bartlett, made it clear that UP was to be, quote, a university for Filipinos, unquote. The Filipino elite took that message to be a recognition of Philippinization as a legitimate aspiration. But whether this is what Bartlett and the American rulers meant by a university for Filipinos is an open question. Bartlett's vision for UP was not to create a copy of the American university, but to build a university appropriate to the needs of this young nation. From the standpoint of the American rulers, it may be safely deduced that the main idea behind UP was to produce a whole generation of educated colonials who could run the various offices of the colonial bureaucracy and minister to the immediate needs of the population. Be sure the UP is not the country's first university, nor is it even the first center for tertiary education to be established by the Americans. The distinction of being the country's oldest university, as we all know, belongs to the Royal Pontifical University of Santo Tomas. And the first tertiary school the Americans built was not UP, by the Philippine Normal School for the training of school teachers. But we can say with confidence that the UP was the first modern center of learning in these islands. It is interesting that Republic Act 9500, 2008, refers to UP as the national university. I understand that this is meant to convey the view that UP is not just any other tertiary institution, but is in fact the premier university of the land. But perhaps there is another sense in which we may interpret the semantic shift. Calling UP the National University of the Philippines instead of State University, to my mind, stresses the university's operational autonomy from the state, even as it remains very much in the service of the Filipino nation. Of course, the objective reality may not always validate this self-understanding. For example, a quick look at the composition of the Board of Regents, and I don't mean just this present board. The university's highest governing body and policy-setting body immediately tells us that while UP is not directly supervised by the Commission on Higher Education, or CHED, the university remains very much a state institution run by individuals appointed by government authority. One look at UP's finances and the annual tedious ritual by which university officials secure these from Congress immediately conveys real and operational constraints on UP's life as a state institution. This situation is certainly very different from that of the richly endowed universities abroad like Harvard and Stanford. But despite all these, and this is the thesis I tried to develop in this lecture, UP over the years has consistently and fiercely asserted its autonomy from the other function systems of society as befits any university worth its name, and I would add, in ways that would make everyone associated with this university proud. How it has put that autonomy to work is another matter worth examining. Almost as soon as it began offering courses at the turn of the 20th century, by the way, our first three colleges were agriculture, medicine, and believe it or not, fine arts. I've never been able to figure that out. No? Fine arts has had the largest number of enrollment, actually, more than 700. The university that the American colonial government imagined as the instrument of Filipino modernization under colonial rule became the refuge of anti-colonial aspirations. It became as well the nursery of liberal and secular thinking in a society that had long known and taken for granted the cultural hegemony of the Catholic Church. Several times in its history, UP did not hesitate to bite the hand that fed it, routinely challenging the decisions taken by the country's highest public officials and opposing those who made the mistake of using political power to intervene in its affairs. The bulk of the narrative that defines the UP we know today precisely consists of remembrances of these revolts and struggles against power. They are the source of living values that define what we like to call Tatak UP. On the whole, I think UP emerged from these battles bearing many scars, undoubtedly, but generally unbowed. These battles are constitutive of UP's evolution as a self-defining and self-governing academic community. It is worth reminding ourselves that they are not over. If we stop fighting such battles, it will be a sure sign of institutional senility and decay. A modern university like UP persists only to the extent that it can protect its boundaries, defend its academic autonomy, and reproduce its operations in an increasingly complex world. The first 100 years of UP may be roughly divided into two phases, the American period and the Filipino period. During the American period, under colonial rule, the question of social relevance was understood in the simple terms of producing highly trained Filipinos who could take over the positions occupied by the Americans in the shortest possible time. UP itself was the first target of this Philippinization movement, a fact that led to the appointment of Ignacio Villamor as the second president of the university in 1915. This brief period brought out a whole generation of educated Filipinos who thought of themselves as builders of a free and modern nation. They dominated the spaces in politics, government, and business that the Americans made available in preparation for eventual self-rule. Independence was the singular obsession of this generation, who felt entitled by their UP training to assume the mantle of the nation's leadership as if it were a natural right. On the other hand, the Filipino period, roughly corresponding to the last 60 years, interpreted social relevance first in terms of independence from a lingering American neocolonial influence, and later in terms of the struggle for social justice and democracy. But somehow, UP's quest for relevance almost throughout the last century suffered from a blind spot. The need to contribute to the attainment of an equitable society was never high in the university's institutional priorities. Somehow, the pursuit of academic excellence produced an intellectual aristocracy that found a secure place in an oligarchical society. Without intending it, the UP became an effective mechanism for the reproduction of a highly unequal society, rather than as a source of enduring impulses towards a more just and equitable social order. We might say this has been UP's incurable blind spot, its failure. It is not to say that equity and social justice never found a home in UP, or indeed there was not a lack of students and professors who would champion the cause of the underprivileged at any point. But for all the talk about institutional relevance, this was never crystallized into enduring programs or policies. Whenever talk of democratizing access into UP was discussed, for instance, the goal of academic excellence would always be flushed like a self-explanatory veto. Why? I believe the answer might be found in the origins of the university itself. UP was founded to serve